Okay, for this last section on our introduction to R, I just want to go over some key aspects of programming in R. So just a brief intro. And so this might be a big step for a lot of people, but it's okay. You don't have to, we're going to walk through it all together. So I think of all these videos as kind of references. So you'll have these videos, you'll have the slideshows, and as you learn, you can come back to these as references. So one of the more important parts of programming are learning how to use what are called loops. And yeah, you'll see what these are. So often we use computers to perform the same analyses when we have to do them multiple times or across multiple samples. And so we can automate this process with loops. And there's two main types of loops, regardless of the programming language. So there's for loops and while loops. And what these do is they repeat specified commands as long as certain conditions are met. And so we'll walk through what this means. So we're going to start out with for loops. And this is really, we're only going to use for loops in this course. I'm going to briefly talk about while loops, but yeah, we're not going to use them. Okay, so this is an example of a for loop. And so how these are structured is so you write for, and then you have the conditions that, so as long as these conditions are met, the for loop is going to run. And then in brackets, you have, I guess, curly, I don't know, people call these things different things. I call them brackets, but some people call them curly brackets, curly braces. Anyway, inside these, you have whatever it's going to do. Like as long as this condition is met, this is what's going to happen. And so in this case, how for loops work is you set you specify a variable name, and this value is going to change each time the program steps through this loop. And so we can call this whatever you want. We call this Bob or whatever. But I'm calling it I here, just that's common. And so, well, for I in, and so then what you specify here is what value it's going to step through. So what this means is the first time through this loop, it's going to set I to 1, and then it's going to run whatever commands are in these brackets. Once it's done that, it's going to come through this loop again, and now I is going to be 2, right? Because we're setting it so for I in 1 to 10. So then I is going to be 2, and it's going to run these commands. Then it's going to come back, and I will be 3, and it's going to run through these. So it's going to do that 10 times, right? For I equals 1 to 10. And that's how loops work, right? You set conditions, you set a variable that's going to change, and you specify how that's going to change here. And then you set in what commands to do each time that variable changes. Now in this case, this command is actually kind of obtuse. It's kind of tricky. And that's just because it had to be this way to make a function that you guys would see something. So you should type this into your R command and see what it does. But I'm going to walk through this. These commands we're not going to use in our class, but they were needed to make this work. So here, this sprintf function, it's just a version of the print function that you use when you don't know what the value will be. So you use print when you know what text you're going to print. But in this case, what text we're going to print is going to change each time through the loop because I is changing. And so in that case, you have to use this sprintf function. And what I want to print to the screen is, in quotes, I is, and now what I is going to be is going to change each time through this loop. So because it's going to change, I have to use what's called a wildcard here. And again, this is kind of advanced, but so if you don't follow this, that's fine. But there's different symbols that you use for different types of wildcards. So I is just going to be 1 through 10, which is an integer. So %d is the wildcard that you use when a value is going to be an integer. And then the -n is a new line. So we're going to print this, and then you have a comma, And then you have what value to use for the wildcard. So we have one wildcard that we're using here. And so we have to tell it what variable to use to fill that wildcard. So here, because I is in quotes, it's going to actually print the letter I. But then it's going to print I space is, and then it's a wildcard here. So it says, okay, an integer is going to be here. And for the integer, use the value that's in the variable I over here. And so here's the different wildcards. Again, we're not going to use these, but just to be thorough, I'm showing them. So %d is for an integer, %s is for text or a character, and %f is for a floating point number. And then here I mentioned this -n is just to print a new line, and then the cat command is just needed to get sprintf to work properly. So after all of that, if you type in this into the command line, or what better yet, type this into the upper right corner of your RStudio workspace, and then hold down Control and hit Enter, then if you do that, what it should write to your screen is this. So the first time through the loop, I is going to be 1. And so it's going to print out I is, and then whatever value I is, and then print a new line. So it's going to be I is 1. Then it's going to loop through it again, and now I is going to be 2. So it's going to print to the screen I is 2. Then it's going to go through again, and this time I is going to be 3. So it'll print to the screen I is 3. And so on. So hopefully this makes sense to you. The idea here is to visualize what's happening in a loop. All it's happening is this variable is changing values according to whatever rules you have here, and then these calculations or whatever, functions are run in here with whatever value is used for I. So we can change it. This is making it a little more complex. So now this definition is the same. So I is still going to change from 1 to 10 each time we loop through these commands. But now we're going to do some calculations. So now we're going to have a new variable, j, that's going to be I times 2 divided by 3. And then we want to print out to this screen what I and j are. So this looks the same. So I is, and then our wildcard for an integer. So I is %d, so an integer. And then j is, now j is going to be a floating point number because we're dividing by 3, so some of these are going to have decimal places. So the wildcard for j has to be %f, and then print a new line. And then the variable that's going to be used for our first wildcard is I. The variable for our second wildcard is j. And so if you run this function, so again, if you type this in to the script position in the upper left of your RStudio workspace, and then hold down Control and hit Enter, what you should see is this. So the first time through this loop, I is going to equal 1. So you'll get I is 1, and j is 1 times 2 divided by 3, so 2/3. So j is point whatever, and so on. So this I part is staying the same, but now I've just add other things into the loop. So you can have as many things inside this loop as you want. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, this part of the command doesn't need to make sense to you because we're not going to use this anymore. This was just to visualize what's happening in the loop. But the idea of loops should make sense to you. So there's also while loops. So for loops step through commands for a predefined number of times, right? So we set this ahead of time. So for I, from 1 to 10. So we predefined how many times to go through the loop. Whereas while loops step through commands as long as a defined condition is met, instead of predefining how many times. So for example, this is just how we could change the previous loop to a while loop. Is we could set I equals to 1, so assign the value 1 to I. And now our condition is that while I is less than or equal to 10, do these commands. But now we have I changing, so I is going to be I plus 1 at the end of this loop. So that way, this won't loop on forever, right? If we didn't change I within the loop, this condition would never be met, and this loop would just go on forever. And so you can usually accomplish the same thing using either a for loop or a while loop. And you use them for different purposes, but in this course, we're really only going to be dealing with for loops. Okay, I think we'll stop this video here before moving on.